the moment my mother finished her sentence, I laughed. Not a small, polite laugh. Not the kind you offer when something is only mildly awkward. I laughed so hard, I had to grab the edge of the kitchen counter to keep myself upright. My mother stared at me like I had lost my mind. My sister just kept smiling, that rehearsed, pageant-ready smile she had been perfecting for 30 years. Neither of them understood why I was laughing. And here's the thing, I couldn't explain it in that moment, because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the money they thought they had quietly rearranged wasn't the money they thought it was at all. Let me take you back to the beginning. My grandfather, Raymond, was the kind of man who said everything once and meant it completely. He sat at the head of our family's Thanksgiving table when I was 12 years old, slid a half-finished crossword puzzle toward me across the tablecloth, and told me I was the only one in this family who would build something that would last. I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I was 12, but I remembered it. When he passed 2 years ago, he left me $312,000. He announced it openly at the table in front of everyone. He said it was for my future, for a house, for a hard year, for the kind of moment where life stops going according to plan and you need something solid underneath you. He had no idea how soon that moment would come. What my family didn't know, what I had been carrying quietly for 3 months before that kitchen conversation, was that I had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, the kind that chips away at you slowly, costing more each month than the one before, burning through savings the way a slow leak burns through a boat. My insurance covered enough to keep me functional. It did not cover enough to keep me safe. There was a clinical trial in Boston, a legitimate shot at something more than maintenance, but it required a relocation deposit, a financial clearance, and a deadline. 14 days from the moment things fell apart. I hadn't told my family any of this. I had learned, over decades of being the quiet daughter, that sharing something serious in my family meant watching it slowly become about someone else. I wasn't ready to hand over this particular thing, not yet. So when my mother sat me down at that dining table and folded her hands and told me they had needed to explain something before I saw the account statement, I had no idea what was coming. And when she said they had borrowed most of my inheritance, temporarily of course, to help fund my sister Amanda's wedding in Napa, complete with a live band, imported flowers, a vineyard buyout, and fireworks, I laughed. Because the money they thought they had taken, it wasn't accessible. They hadn't touched the trust. My grandfather had been meticulous. The trust was iron tight. I was the sole beneficiary. His attorney, Mr. Halpern, was the primary trustee. My father was listed only as a successor trustee in the event that Mr. Halpern became incapacitated, which he had not. My father had exactly zero legal authority to move a single dollar from that account. And I knew this, so I laughed, because whatever they thought they had done, they were wrong. And I laughed because Amanda squeezed my hand across the table and said, with genuine certainty, "You didn't really need it." And I laughed because they had no idea what I actually needed, or what I had been quietly fighting for 3 months. Or what I already knew about trust law before I had even walked through their front door. I said okay. I took the leftovers I didn't want. I tucked the wedding invitation into my purse like a receipt for something I hadn't purchased. And when I got into my car in the driveway, I didn't cry. I called Mr. Halpern. He picked up on the second ring. I explained what my parents had said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me that no transfer from the trust had ever been authorized. He asked me to come to his office first thing in the morning. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was devastated, because something wasn't adding up. If the trust was untouched, where had the Napa money come from? Mr. Halpin's office smelled like old paper and strong coffee. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He pulled out the trust documents and walked me through everything. The structure was exactly as I remembered. The balance was intact. $312,000 plus accumulated interest, sitting right where my grandfather had put it. Untouched, unbothered. He turned to me and asked if there were any other accounts connected to my grandfather's estate. And that was when the cold feeling started. There had been one other thing. When Grandpa died, my parents offered to help me consolidate some older savings accounts. I was grieving. I was exhausted. I signed whatever paperwork they put in front of me. They told me it was a tax simplification measure, something about avoiding complications for young account holders. My father said it would be easier if he was added as a joint account holder, just temporarily. Banks make things complicated, he said. I believed him. Mr. Halpin asked me to pull up that account on my phone. The balance was $14.82. I stared at the number. I knew it hadn't been $14 before. I scrolled to the transaction history. What I found there was not an accident, and it was not a misunderstanding. There were multiple large withdrawals spread across 9 months, broken into smaller amounts that individually fell just below the automatic fraud alert threshold, a pattern that would only exist if someone understood exactly how banking surveillance worked and deliberately worked around it. Amanda's venue deposit, the floral designer, a yacht rental for the rehearsal dinner, the honeymoon suite in Italy, the fireworks permit, all funded by me. Not from the trust my grandfather built to protect me. From the savings account I had been quietly building since I was 16 years old, the one my grandfather had been slipping birthday checks into for years before the formal trust was ever drafted, the one my father had positioned himself on, quietly, while I was grieving. I wasn't looking at a borrowed inheritance. I was looking at 9 months of calculated theft. Mr. Halpin leaned back in his chair and explained it plainly. The transfers had been structured intentionally to avoid triggering automatic alerts. That wasn't impulsive. That wasn't a moment of bad judgment. That was planning. That was knowledge. That was my father, who checked my math homework at this very table, engineering a financial fraud against his own daughter, while she was sick and hadn't told anyone. I looked at the last transaction. 3 days ago, labeled final vendor balance, the day before my mother called to invite me over to talk. They had already known I was about to see the account. They just assumed I would check the wrong one first. I authorized Mr. Halpin to act on my behalf before I left his office. I didn't call my parents. I didn't send an angry text. I went home and let them think I had accepted it. 2 days later, my mother called and asked if I could help assemble welcome bags for Amanda's wedding guests, folding monogrammed napkins. I went. I sat at their kitchen counter, tying ribbon around champagne bottles engraved with A and D forever, and I asked casual questions. How much had the wedding cost in total? Around $400,000. Amanda said, but everything was covered. Derek's parents had contributed generously. They had also taken a short-term bridge loan for timing gaps. Totally normal, Derek said. Once the gifts came in, they would settle everything. Bridge loan. I filed that away. That night, Mr. Halpin filed a formal demand letter requesting an immediate freeze on the joint account and a forensic review of all transfers. Because my father had structured the withdrawals to avoid automated alerts, the manual flag triggered an internal fraud escalation at the bank. The next morning, my dad called. He asked if I had spoken to the bank. I said I had noticed some discrepancies. He told me I was overreacting. He said paperwork could sort everything out after the wedding. I asked him why, if this was simply a family borrowing. the money had been moved in deliberate increments over 9 months rather than through a single transparent conversation. He didn't answer that. He said instead that if I caused problems now, vendors might back out, deposits could be lost. Amanda would be humiliated in front of hundreds of guests. I told him I wasn't the one who had structured fraudulent transfers. He hung up. That afternoon, Mr. Halpern called with an update. The bank had confirmed it. The funds had been routed from my savings account into a secondary account in my father's name, then distributed to vendors. That routing made it traceable. It also meant that if I filed a civil claim fast enough, disputed funds tied to those vendors could potentially be reversed. My phone buzzed. Amanda, just saw Dad is stressed. Please don't do anything dramatic. I stared at that message for a long time. She still thought I was bluffing. She still thought the quiet daughter wouldn't fight back. What she didn't know was that I had already signed the legal recovery paperwork that morning. What she also didn't know was that the clinical trial coordinator in Boston had just emailed me. One final slot, financial clearance, required within 14 days. 14 days. Amanda's wedding was in 12. Things moved fast after that. Monday, Mr. Halpern filed the civil complaint, quietly. No courtroom drama, just documents with enormous downstream consequences. Tuesday afternoon, 3 vendors were formally notified that portions of their payments were under dispute due to alleged unauthorized transfers. Wednesday morning, Amanda called 13 times. I let it go to voicemail. Then Derek called. Their wedding planner had contacted them in a panic. The vineyard in Napa required written confirmation that the funds they had received were not connected to active fraud litigation. Their insurance policy required it. The yacht company was reviewing their contract. The fireworks company had paused shipment pending verification. Derek asked me directly if I had done something. I said I had corrected something. That evening, my mother appeared at my apartment door, unannounced. She said I was humiliating the family. She said Amanda was barely sleeping. I asked if Amanda had slept well for the 9 months she watched my savings disappear. One transfer at a time. My mother didn't answer that. She said instead what I suspected all along. They had assumed I wouldn't notice. Not because they genuinely believed I had no use for the money, because I was the quiet one, because I was tired a lot, and they mistook exhaustion for passivity because they thought I wouldn't fight. They were wrong about all of it. The following morning, Mr. Halpern forwarded me the bank's preliminary internal review. The pattern of transfers met the threshold for intentional structuring. That phrase, intentional structuring, changed the nature of the matter entirely. This was no longer a civil dispute between family members. It was a potential criminal referral. Mr. Halpern asked me if I wanted to escalate beyond financial recovery. Mr. Halpern asked me if I wanted to escalate beyond financial recovery. Amanda texted, "Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. We can pay you back after the wedding. Don't ruin this for me." I looked at the medical bills on my table. I looked at the 14-day countdown on my calendar. I looked at the brochure for the clinical trial that I had been carrying in my bag like a secret for 3 months. I replied to Mr. Halpern, "Yes, escalate." The word criminal travels fast inside a bank investigation. By Friday, my father had retained his own attorney. The secondary account in his name was frozen. Most of it had already been disbursed to vendors, but the freeze triggered something none of us anticipated. The lender for Derek's bridge loan ran a routine compliance check. Their policy required that no active fraud investigations be tied to borrowers or immediate family contributors. The loan was paused. Derek's father, who had contributed significantly, under the assumption that the remaining funds were legitimate family savings, suddenly learned that the story he had been told, that it was a family reallocation I had agreed to, an investment in Amanda's future, was not accurate. Amanda showed up at my apartment on Saturday without the smile. Derek's father wanted documentation. He was threatening to pull their contribution entirely if there was legal exposure. The vineyard was requesting assurances. The yacht company had already begun a contract review. Half the vendors were in limbo. She said I was destroying her life over money I hadn't even used. That was when I told her. I told her about the diagnosis, about the autoimmune disorder I had been quietly managing for 3 months, about the clinical trial in Boston, the one real shot I had at something better than slow deterioration, about the 14-day deadline, about the relocation deposit, that my own savings, the savings she and my father had systematically drained, was supposed to cover. She stared at me. She asked why I had never said anything. I told her, because every time something serious happened in this family, it became about her. For once, I wanted something to just be mine to carry. She didn't apologize. She asked if I could pause the escalation until after the wedding. I said no. 2 days later, 2 of the largest vendors reversed partial payments preemptively, rather than risk entanglement in a fraud case. The vineyard was one of them. A 6-figure reversal held in escrow pending investigation. Then the lender completed their deeper review of Derek's financial disclosures and found something unrelated to my case entirely. Inflated income projections tied to a startup he claimed was approaching a major funding round. It wasn't. The loan was denied outright. The wedding was underfunded by an enormous margin. The vendors were in dispute. Derek's family was furious. On Sunday night, Amanda called to tell me the wedding had been postponed indefinitely. Before she hung up, she said something I didn't expect. She said maybe Grandpa had known exactly what he was doing when he left the money to me specifically. I didn't respond. For the first time in months, I had nothing to say. The bank finalized its report on a Wednesday. Intentional structuring, unauthorized transfers, beneficiary funds misappropriated. The language was clinical and detached. It didn't mention the dining room table or the crossword puzzles or the homework checks. It was just facts assembled in a document, and those facts were now in the hands of the district attorney's office for review. An hour after Mr. Halpern called me, my father called me, not to argue, not to explain. He asked to meet. We sat in Mr. Halpern's conference room. Just the 3 of us. My father looked older than I remembered him looking even a few weeks before. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a proposal. Full restitution. Every dollar returned through a combination of liquidated personal assets and a home equity line. Legal fees covered. A written admission of unauthorized transfers to satisfy the bank's recovery requirements. In exchange, I would ask the district attorney to consider the matter resolved civilly. I asked him one question. What did he think would happen? He said he had believed it would be temporary, that Amanda was under pressure, that Derek's family had expectations. That I would understand, the way I had always understood, the way I had always quietly absorbed whatever the family needed without complaint. He said, "You never asked for anything. That was the problem." He was right about that, and it was the most honest thing he had said to me in years. I signed the settlement the next day. Within a week, the reversed vendor payments and my father's liquidated assets were transferred back in full. Every cent, plus accumulated interest. My mother stopped calling. Amanda moved out of state eventually. The wedding never happened. Derek's startup folded completely within a month. I heard that through a cousin. I wasn't looking for updates. 2 days before the clinical trial deadline, I wired the deposit to the hospital in Boston. I signed my intake forms alone in a small apartment near the research center. It was quiet. It was mine. There was no one to perform recovery for, no one to reassure, no one to manage. The night before my first treatment, Amanda sent me one final message. She said she had finally read Grandpa's original trust letter, the one I had never actually seen. Mr. Halpern forwarded me a scanned copy that same night. Grandpa had written it 6 months before he passed. He explained, in his careful and unhurried way, why he had structured the trust the way he did, why he had been so deliberate about the legal architecture, why he had chosen Mr. Halpern and not my parents as the primary trustee. He wrote that I was resilient, but often underestimated. He wrote that the quiet ones sometimes need the most protection, not because they are fragile, but because the people around them mistake their silence for consent. At the bottom, in the last line, he wrote one sentence I will never forget. Sydney will laugh when she is hurt. That is how you will know something is wrong. I didn't laugh reading that. I cried. Not with grief, exactly. Not grief for my family. Not grief for what I had lost. I cried because, for the first time, I understood something about myself that I had never been able to name. I had spent my entire life trying to be the one who didn't need anything, not a burden, not a complication, not a drain on the family's attention or resources or patience. I had made myself so small for so long that when something genuinely threatened my life, I almost didn't fight for it. Almost. My first treatment started the following morning. The money that had been set aside to protect me was finally doing exactly what it was always meant to do. Not funding fireworks for someone else's celebration. Not covering a yacht or a vineyard or a honeymoon suite in Italy. It was keeping me alive. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I had to apologize for that.